Virtue ethics. Understanding virtue ethics for an interpretation of classical Confucian ethics. Most Western students approach morality from the perspective of rules. Morality is a set of rules to be followed. These rules are thought to govern our conduct toward others. For example, we might take it that there is a moral rule that says, don't lie. Two modern approaches to moral philosophy emphasize rules. One of these is deontology, a school that is very closely associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant. In it, moral rules are reflective of duties that are established by reason. The other is rule utilitarianism. In it, moral rules are reflective of arrangements that yield greater utility. It is usually represented, as in this sign, as being forward-looking. But this is not how it is reflected in Mill or Sidgwick, perhaps the two greatest voices of utilitarianism. For them, rules of justice survive because they are utility-bearing. In any case, both Kantian deontology and utilitarianism in general are rule-based at a more fundamental level. Both derive all judgment of moral action from a single overarching principle. Armed with their respective principles, they each seek to give a decision procedure that will tell an agent what to do in any situation. In the 20th century, general dissatisfaction began to grow with the two modern ethical theories. In part, this was because anomalies were identified within the decision procedure of each of the two major schools. Sometimes these procedures tell an actor to do something that runs contrary to ordinary moral intuitions. For instance, under some conditions, it seems morally appropriate to lie. We might think it morally reprehensible to tell the truth to the Nazis who are searching for Jews. Yet that seems to be what the deontological decision procedure calls for. On the other hand, the utilitarian decision procedure seems to authorize the oppression of minorities if that oppression will result in a net utility benefit. A whole series of trolley thought experiments further tested our moral intuitions about utilitarianism. In addition, the two primary schools were seen to be somewhat out of sync with some of our more general intuitions about morality and the good life. The deontological approach divorces morality from happiness. The life of morality is compatible with the life of misery. At the same time, we might not be comfortable with utilitarianism's assertion that the goal of life is one of pleasure maximization. In response to these difficulties, beginning in the 1950s, the British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, who had been a student of Ludwig Wittgenstein, began to revitalize an old way of thinking about morality. Her 1958 book, Modern Moral Philosophy, re-energized interest among academic philosophers in classical virtue ethics. Her thinking was profoundly influential on the Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, and in turn, his seminal book, After Virtue, is widely considered to be one of the greatest pieces of moral philosophy of the 20th century. The virtue ethics they elaborated was thought to be a corrective, in some ways, to the weaknesses of the two modern theories. It emphasized good judgment over rules. It also connected morality back to ideas about what makes for a good life. Of course, the return to virtue ethics was a return to the moral philosophy of classical Western philosophers. Plato, the Stoics, medieval Christianity, and most especially Aristotle. It is worth noting here that the version of virtue ethics found among the classical Chinese is of an even older vintage than that of the Greeks, and it is a central feature of many of the philosophies that we will be examining in this course. In virtue ethics, the direction of moral judgment is different from that found in modern ethics. Modern ethical theories make judgment on actions. The judgment values are right and wrong. Virtue ethics makes a judgment on the person, and its values are good and bad. In other words, in virtue ethics, character counts. That notion of character consists in the sum total of good qualities a person has, and these good qualities are understood to be the virtues. How do we know, though, which qualities are really virtues? After all, someone might be an excellent burglar, or an excellent tyrant, or even a great liar, as was supposed to be the great Greek hero Odysseus. Plato introduces us to the idea of a function. The function of a thing, he tells us, is what it alone can do, or what it does better than anything else. For instance, the function of a hammer is to drive nails. You can, of course, use something else to drive nails, like, say, a rock, but it is just not going to work as well as a hammer, because the function of a hammer is to drive nails, and a rock doesn't have that function. Plato defines virtue in terms of a thing's function. Thus, the virtue of a hammer is performing well its function of driving nails. When something performs its function well, we say that thing is a good one. A good hammer drives nails well. That is the virtue of a hammer. This leads us to understand that virtue is excellence of function. So we can have a good carpenter as someone who performs the function of carpentry well, and we can have a good soldier as someone who performs the soldier's function well, but this doesn't prevent either of them from being a bad person. Nor does it keep us from identifying a good tyrant as someone who performs the functions of being a tyrant well, a function which, if performed, would likely identify that person as a bad person. We need something more to make virtue into a moral category instead of merely a practical category. In order to know what a good person is, we need to know what the function of a person as such is. Aristotle steps in here to give us this understanding. He tells us what the function of a person is. Remember that a function is that which only this kind of a thing can do. If persons as such have some function that they alone among other kinds of things can perform, then that function needs to be distinguished from what other things like plants or beasts can do. In what has come to be called the function argument, Aristotle eliminates as a possible function what is common to both persons and plants, namely a nutritive function. Both plants and persons absorb nutrients from their environment and grow, but since this is a shared activity, it is not unique to persons, so it cannot be the function of persons as such. He next considers sentient activity, that is, using the senses to respond to the environment. He eliminates this capacity too because persons share it with animals. Finally, he settles on the capacity for acting with rationality as the function of persons because on his reckoning, only persons can do this. So for Aristotle, all those qualities that can be counted as genuinely good accord with rationality. And those that don't are vicious. A person, though, in addition to a rational part, has a nutritive part and a sentient part. Neither of these other two parts is in itself rational. One of them, however, the sentient part, will respond to reason. The other, the nutritive part, will not. Reason then manifests itself in two ways for persons, originally in the rational part and responsively in the sentient part. Subsequently, Aristotle divides virtue into two kinds, intellectual virtue and moral virtue. By intellectual virtue, Aristotle means attaining excellence in the unique human function. That means fully realizing our potential as rational beings. This branch of virtue relates directly to the rational part of the person. It is also an aspect of developing a good life. Remember that the modern approaches to ethics seem to be deficient in this area. Moral virtue speaks to the part of a person that is not itself rational, but is responsive to reason. It is developed by habit, by example. It may involve learning some moral rules, but these rules are not exhaustive and cannot fully define virtue. It involves developing judgment and using it to evaluate one's own experience. This idea of using our judgment against our experience is the basis of Aristotle's famous golden mean. The idea is usually illustrated by the virtue of courage. Courage is thought to be a mean between a vice of deficiency cowardice and a vice of excess, rashness, or foolhardiness. Aristotle says that there is no precise mathematical mean between the vices. We recall our experience. Sometimes we have failed to respond appropriately to fear. We use our judgment of these experiences to determine what the appropriate level of response to fear should be. It cannot be governed by a discrete rule. For Aristotle, a right action is one that would be performed by a virtuous person. A just act is an act that the just person would do. All this is learned by habit. A just person becomes just by performing just acts. A temperate person becomes temperate by performing temperate acts. Virtue consists in doing the right thing with respect to the right person at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way. The wise person must determine these rightnesses using experience and judgment. Recall that one of the criticisms of the modern ethical system was that they did not seem to properly attend to the connection between morality and living well. In contrast to those theories, Aristotle places human flourishing, or well-being, or more simply happiness, at the center of his theory. It is the end or purpose or telos of morality. He distinguishes human happiness from pleasure, which is an appropriate end for purely sentient beings, but not for logos-using beings. He manages to tie happiness to reason and morality through the concept of virtue. Here is the unusual but really quite profound definition he has of happiness. Happiness is an activity of the soul in accord with perfect virtue. Aristotle argues to justify the claim that the set of qualities he identifies are in fact virtues. These include the cardinal virtues of temperance, wisdom, courage, and justice. His list includes many other virtues as well. These four cardinal virtues have corresponding qualities that we find in Chinese philosophy. As to temperance, consider this passage from the first book of the Li Ji. Pride should not be allowed to grow. The desires should not be indulged. The will should not be gratified to the full. Pleasure should not be carried to excess. Besides these virtues, classical Chinese philosophy also includes the important qualities of benevolence, or Ren, filial piety, or Xiao, and sympathetic understanding, or Shu, among other virtues. We will begin examining the qualities that the classical Chinese think of as virtues, and we will think about what qualities these characteristics as what qualifies these characteristics as virtues for the Chinese.